Okay, as you kind of may have gathered from that long litany of things Bruce has done, I represent the establishment. Okay, this is sort of the official view of things that have happened at Hanford and what it means for the rest of us. And I put myself here as formerly chief scientist because I retired from PNNL about a year ago. I'm still doing things with the United Nations and with EPA and other organizations, so some of us feel retirement fairly badly. But we're going to go back and talk about really what was released from Hanford, where did it go, and what effect did it have on people. So if I push this button, the bottom one, okay. I'm going to break it up into 4 major parts. Releases to soil, in other words, stuff that got buried or got released as liquids. Radionuclide releases to surface water, and the main surface water that we're talking about is the Columbia River. And radionuclide releases to the air. This is the big one. And what these things really mean to people and a little bit to biota. I don't have a lot on biota. So let's just talk about Hanford soils. There's been about over almost 2/3 of a million cubic meters of solids disposed in trenches at the Hanford site. And there's more than 1.5 billion cubic meters of liquids. And that's mostly water. And most of that water came from the Columbia River, went through 2 fairly large pumping stations up to the 200 east and west areas, where, as Brian said, it was used in industrial processes, the steam jets. When you're done jetting something with steam, it condenses, and you get rid of the water. The water is then disposed of. There were large ponds in both the 200 east and 200 west areas, and there were many, many structures that are called cribs, which are basically kind of like septic tanks. You put your contaminated liquid in it, it soaks into the ground. The idea behind that, of course, is that any contaminants should stick with the dirt and the water will go away. Now, if you start adding up how much stuff was disposed, there's an awful lot of tritium, an awful lot of strontium-90 and cesium-137. Actually, not a whole lot of plutonium or americium. But some of these things have fairly long half-lives. Some of them are kind of important and are contributing to the cleanup today, and others of them are already gone. So let's think about this for a minute. I have 2 maps here. The map on the left is from 1988. I happened to find a 1988 map of the tritium plumes coming from the 200 west and 200 east areas. The plumes are different sizes, and that's interesting simply because the geology is different. There's more permeable soils in east area than in west area, and the stuff hasn't moved as far yet. But the plume from east area had hit the river considerably before 1988. And this map on the other side is the 2022 map. And you can see this is, again, mostly the tritium plume. It's shrunk. Now, why is it shrinking? Well, it's shrinking because it's no longer being generated out here in East area. It's not. They've pretty much shut down all those facilities. The water releases are much lower. The water table has actually fallen because when you put billions of gallons of water into the ground, it actually raised up the water table quite a bit. It is now sinking back down. The flow rate has slowed because there's not so much gradient. And tritium has about a 10-year half-life. And so between 88 and 22, there's three half-lives, or maybe a little more. So half, quarter, 1/8 just from decay, and then some more from dilution, and more from having seeped into the Columbia River. Some of this material does actually come into the Columbia River. There is a noticeable, measurable increase in the tritium concentration of the Columbia River between Priest Rapids Dam and the Richland water intake. It comes to about 25 picocuries per liter. It's not a very big change, but it's noticeable. And while I'm here, I'm going to mention, because some of this is going to our Japanese friends, where the tritium comes from. Okay, we're processing nuclear waste, or nuclear materials, and creating nuclear waste. Most of what we think of as fission is where uranium breaks into two big chunks. A strontium-90 and a cesium-137, approximately. Every now and then, maybe 1% of the time, maybe less, is a process called ternary fission, where you get those two big chunks and you get a little chunk. And that little chunk is tritium. And tritium is just an extra proton with a couple of neutrons added onto it. It behaves like normal hydrogen, and because we're condensing an awful lot of water, it's generally just as tritiated water. So it's tritium moving along through the system. And the same general source is what happened at Fukushima, and they're now releasing tritiated water into the Pacific Ocean. Same process, same idea, different amounts. Now, how might people be exposed to this stuff that's been released to the ground? Well, you release it to the groundwater, it can either go to, say, a well, or it can go to the river. On the Hanford site, there are no publicly accessible water wells because we happen to know that the groundwater is contaminated. There was, for a time, at the fast flux test facility out in the 400 area, there was a public visitor center. And that visitor center actually did use groundwater for many years. So that was a source of exposure to the public that they finally said, yeah, this is not a good idea. They turned it off and started bringing in bottled water. That's not used anymore. So the major source, of course, is here into the river and then out of the river. So irrigating, food crops, getting it onto the soil, people swimming and boating in the river and just drinking it. So one of my friends back in the Hanford dose reconstruction days said, well, how might groundwater affect people? What would the doses be? And migration to the Columbia River, peak annual dose from that particular pathway of about 0.02 millirem per year, which is a very small number in millisieverts, primarily from tritium, a little bit from technetium-99 and iodine-129, with kind of a peak year of about 1989. So that was when that plume really finally hit the river at its maximum, and then it started to shrink back. Now, if you live across the river in Franklin County, we really don't think that the material can get there. It has to go under the river and come up the other side and get into your well. And so we really didn't think that there's a whole lot of groundwater impact on the Franklin County side. Now, Hanford drinking water, this is again that particular well at FFTF, the doses were really small simply because people weren't there very long. Not too many visitors came out every day of the week for 50 weeks a year. But again, tritium was pretty much the peak radionuclide, and that ended about 1977 when they kind of stopped doing that. I actually went to that visitor center. I remember it there. Now, a riparian well is one that's next to the river, taking water that is essentially river water out of the groundwater. We'll talk about these a little more with the surface water releases, simply because the city of Kennewick gets its drinking water supply from riparian wells. City of Richland gets it straight from the river. Kennewick, at least, they use wells that are nearby. And they would have peaked back in the 1960s from a whole bunch of different things. And then there's atmospheric transport, deposition, and of contaminated materials, transport into groundwater. And again, the doses there would have been pretty small and dominated in 1945 when the releases of those particular materials were the highest. So these numbers are not real big. So now let's move on to the river itself. So we've got all that stuff that went into the groundwater is slowly reaching the river. What about the river? Well, back in the early days, when those 8 production reactors were operating, they were cooled with water from the river. It came in from the river, went through a cleanup plant, went through the facility, came out the other side, held up for a couple of hours in retention basins, and then was pumped back into the river. The reason for the retention basins was primarily to cool it off because it was near boiling when it came out of the reactors, and you didn't want to put boiling water in the river because it might hurt the fish. That water, as it went through, carried chemicals and materials and just ions and other things from the river that were activated by the neutrons in the reactor. That's the primary source of most of these radionuclides that I have listed here. There were also failures of the fuel element cladding where you'd get a hole, a pinhole leak or something in one of the fuel slugs, and some uranium would dissolve and the stuff would come out with it. So that's where the fission products, some of the iodine and yttrium, came from. There was a lot of material released into the river from the operations of the reactors. If you look at these numbers, these are in curies and these are in becquerels. A becquerel is 1 disintegration per second. This is the cumulative release is 4 exabecquerels, which is 4 with what is it? 18 zeros after it. It's a huge number. Even in curies, it's 1 billion curies. Okay, think about that. We have the tanks. Have what, 100 million curies left in them. We released 1 billion curies. Now, what does this tell us? It tells us first that a curie or a becquerel is a lousy unit to base your life on, because most of them have really, really short half-lives, a couple hours. My analogy here is that the reactors were giant bottles of mineral water, fizzy. You dump a bunch of fizzy water in the river, and by the time it gets to Richland, it's gone flat. Same thing is happening here. We're dumping gazillion becquerels, lots and lots of disintegrations per second, into the Columbia River from the reactors. It's flowing downstream. Here, peaked in the mid-1960s when all 8 reactors were operating at full bore. That's a lot of material. So what does it mean? Well, what it means. Okay, let's look here. I want to go back up here. Let's look at sodium-24. Sodium-24 is one of the more interesting ones. Has a 15-hour half-life. It's got huge numbers of curies. This is the concentration of sodium-24 in Columbia River water at Richland and at Portland, Oregon. Now you have to notice that there's a scale difference here. This one goes up to 12,000. This one goes up to 5,000. And what you're seeing here is between 1950 and 1970, the first thing you see is it goes up and down and up and down and up and down. That's the flow rate of the Columbia. The concentration is low during spring flood because it's dilute, and the concentration is high in August, September, October because the river is very low. But it peaked again in the early 1960s. But just between Richland and Portland, something with what did I say that was, a 15-hour half-life, has decreased by maybe a factor of 3 going from here to Portland. So now, how might people be exposed to stuff in the river? That's very similar to what we had for groundwater, except it's straight into the river. You could irrigate with it. Cattle can drink it. They can eat things that are irrigated. You can swim, you can boat, you can eat fish, and you can drink the water. So what kind of exposures did people get from this? Well, let's start with what we define as a maximum individual. It's somebody who drinks water from the river, eats fish from the river, plays down by the waterside, has a boat. And this particular individual, now, we call him a maximum individual. The Native American tribes claim that they're maximum because they eat more fish, but some of the fish they eat don't have the same concentrations in them as the native fish, or the resident fish. So there's lots of argument about what a maximum individual is, but we define one. And if you look at it, again, the dose peaked in the 1960s. The dark gray bits, I've stolen these pictures from publications from the Hanford Environmental Dose Reconstruction, most of which were created before the digital age, and I had to scan the blooming things in so the figures aren't real clear, but hopefully you can read them. So the ones that we generated with in the header program were between 1950 and 1970, and in later years, the site puts out an annual report every year, and you can go and you can look and see what they think is happening at those periods. What's important here is the magnitude. That's 125 millirem per year. Current limit for a member of the public from DOE operations is 100 millirem a year. In the old days, it was 500. Just before the start of the Hanford Dose Reconstruction Project, right after the release of the 18,000 pages of formally classified documents, I was at a meeting over in Olympia about one of these Hanford site annual reports. And I said, no, the doses here, it was back in the mid-80s. Doses here are really small. They're really small compared to what they were in the past. And somebody asked me, well, what were they in the past? I said, back in the 60s, they were pushing the limits. And pushing the limits made the front page of every newspaper in the state and led to, among other things, the start of the Hanford Dose Reconstruction. So I can claim I helped start it. So let's take a typical individual, which is somebody like most of us who live in the area. We drink water, happens to come out of the river, but we don't eat massive quantities of fish, and we don't irrigate our own cornfields. So you can see that for a typical individual, the doses were on the order of 5 millirem a year, and it depends on where you were. So the black dots are Ringgold, which is kind of to the north. These bigger dots are, I guess that's Ringgold. Lower River is way down here. This funny one here is important. This one that jumps up in 1964, that's the city of Richland. Why did Richland jump up in 1964? In October of 1963, Richland inaugurated their water treatment plant that takes water from the Columbia River. Prior to that, they got water from the Yakima. So as soon as that happened, some friends of mine had a mobile whole body counter in a truck. They took it around to schools in the Tri-Cities. They brought kids in and they counted them in their whole body count. Everybody in Richland had a signature of zinc 65 and sodium 24 in their bodies because they drank Columbia River water. Now they weren't very high, maybe 5 millirem a year, but it was visible and it was there. Now, for reference, this is the view from my backyard. I am the Hanford maximum individual because I actually, in years past, had a permit from the Corps of Engineers to suck water out of the river, and I used it to irrigate my yard and my garden. I have a boat down there. And so, my neighbors say if Bruce ever leaves town, they're going to move too, because I know more than they do. So now let's move on to the big releases, the atmospheric releases. As Brian said, when you irradiate nuclear fuel, you run a reactor. Well, the reactors tended to release a little bit of tritium, some carbon-14, and a whole lot of argon-41. Now, argon-40 is a natural component of the atmosphere. A couple percent of the air we breathe is argon. And when the reactors were operating, air got into the giant graphite stack, and then that air got pumped up and went out the vent stacks, and release about 500,000 curies per year of argon-41. But it has a fairly short half-life. It has a strong gamma, and so there's a little bit coming from there. But the big numbers are over here from reprocessing. And again, as Brian said, you take the fuel, you store it for a while. In the early days when they really, really wanted the plutonium, maybe 30 days. And then they would take it into the dissolver, first you cover it with sodium hydroxide to dissolve the aluminum cladding, and then you pour in a bunch of boiling nitric acid and you dissolve the uranium. Well, certain things are volatile at boiling water temperatures and atmospheric pressure, such as iodine and ruthenium. So the major releases besides noble gases, which I haven't even bothered to list here, major release was I-131. Around 750,000 curies, or a whole mess of becquerels. And this number, I stole it from Cal Heeb, who was the person who did it for the header program. I actually later revised these numbers by going into the records myself and looking at some things that people had complained about Cal's numbers. And this number got a little bit bigger, went up to 750. But I'm using Cal's reference. So our big release, and the thing we really were concerned about, was iodine. This is the time series of what was released by month from iodine, from mostly tea plant up until the 1951 there. This is the one that got everything started. That's the green run, the 1949 intentional experimental release, where they took and said, okay, we're not going to hold this fuel up for very long. We're not going to let the iodine decay. We're just going to dissolve it because we want to see if we can trace where it goes. This got everybody upset, got everybody looking at the records, and got me to figure out that, yeah, this is what was really important. So most of it, between early 1945 and the end of 1947, before certain procedural changes, the major procedural change was to change the cooling time from about 30 days to about 90 days in the end of 1945. As soon as they had the first plutonium to make the first weapon and the war ended, the pressure was off, they could wait a little bit and make the system better. Part of the reason, that was part of the reason. The other part was they finally realized that, we're releasing an awful lot of iodine. It's kind of building up in the environment. We need to do something about that. So, how might people be exposed to this atmospheric release? Well, we have it coming out of the stack, primarily, and it diffuses around. It blows up downwind. It can deposit on the ground. You can breathe it directly. It can fall out on crops, which you can eat, or cattle can eat the crops, and you can eat the meat, or you can drink the milk, or you can eat the wildlife. What's interesting is that a process that was kind of unknown until an accident in England some years later really made it obvious that iodine released into the air, depositing on grass, being eaten by cattle, gets into the milk. Iodine is preferentially transferred into the milk of most mammals, including people. This wasn't known at the time. They realized that the cattle were getting fairly high doses. They actually sent people out in cars with Geiger counters downwind across in Franklin County, and they would occasionally go out and they would wrestle a cow down and measure its thyroid. And they actually started a program to buy thyroids from farmers, cattle thyroids from farmers when they slaughtered their cattle, as a method of tracking what was going on. They wanted to make sure they were not going to kill the cows. And it took several years before they went, it'd be easier just to buy the milk because that's where it's going. So now for the header project, we estimated radiation doses from radioiodine released to the atmosphere. This was our major finding. And we looked at an area that was 75,000 square miles over 3 states, Washington, Oregon, and Idaho. And as you can see, it's a pretty big area down into northern Idaho, or northern Oregon, most of the Idaho panhandle. And we stopped just 5 miles short of the Canadian border. When I first drew this map and presented it to my management, they said, you can't do that. because it'll look like we're ignoring the Canadians. So we have to move it down. We had some nice discussions with some friendly gentlemen from Ontario, from Ottawa, from the Canadian Parliament about this. They understood what we were doing, and we worked with them, but it stayed 5 miles south of the border. So in that area, here's the total iodine deposition. Whoop, come back here. Now this is undecayed. Now iodine has an 8-day half-life. So you release it, and you come back in 8 days, and half of it's gone, and you come back in another week, and half of it's gone, and you come back in another week, and it goes down fairly rapidly. So total cumulative deposition, and the wind kind of blows like this. It's interesting. We always think of the northwest winds here in the Tri-Cities as being the obnoxious ones. Historically, it actually has a swing to it and takes it up to Spokane. So the downwinders, besides being these folks here in Franklin County, extend all the way up to Spokane and even the Canadians. Don't tell them. So the highest depositions, of course, were right here downwind, and then in the immediate vicinity. So we have air concentrations, we have depositions, we can estimate human exposures. So and as I said, iodine tends to concentrate in human thyroids and cattle thyroids and other things thyroids, because it's part of the thyroxine hormones that regulate growth and metabolism and all sorts of other things. So your body is actively searching out iodine whenever it can. So for a maximally exposed adult, somebody who lived on a farm, grew their own cattle and drank the milk, the dose in 1945 was the highest. It was about 33 rad. Now that's 33,000 millirad, which is a pretty big number. Now, and as you can see, 1945, as we saw from the releases, was the biggest year. 46, 47 were smaller. 1949, when the green run occurred, was not real big, in part because that release happened in December and there weren't too many cows eating fresh grass outside in December. We spent a lot of time interviewing farmers. What do you feed your cows? When do you feed them? There's cows on stored feed, there's cows on fresh pasture. When does the shift occur? Where does your pasture come from? We had to account for all that kind of stuff. Now, this is the same figure on a logarithmic scale, and you can see that even in a logarithmic scale by the 1960s, the doses were really small. But in the early years, they were pretty big. So this is for an adult. So again, for an adult, for the early years, 1944 to 1951, cumulative dose from all pathways for somebody who had a milk cow that was out on fresh pasture eating the grass could have been as high as, as we said, about 25, 30 rad. Given that the annual limit is 0.1, we kind of exceeded what we would consider to be a reasonable dose today. Dose to children. Children are smaller than adults. They're growing faster, they need more iodine, and they tend to drink more milk. If you do the dose to a child who is in the same household as that adult, the pattern is kind of the same, but the maximum dose is up to 230, 2 gray. This is a big number. This is a really big number. If your whole body got that much, you would have radiation sickness. Okay? We didn't know this in 1945, but we should have. Or at least you could have figured it out. Now, the milk pathway was pretty important. The same child who drank commercial milk from the dairy would have been maybe half or less. And the reason is that milk from the dairy comes out of the cow, it goes into the can, it goes to the processor, it gets put in a bottle, it gets delivered to your house or you pick it up at the store, and there's been a lag time of something on the order of almost a week. So Simply by having commercial foods, you get less of a dose than if you have your own cow. What's also interesting about this, I'm going to show this figure and then this figure again. Here, up around north of Yakima all the way up into Ellensburg, hay was being transported from the downwind areas and being fed to cattle over there. So we had to look at the shipment of hay, among other things, so that even the commercial foods were impacted in ways that were very hard to determine and took a lot of time and effort. Over the 5 or so years of the Hanford dose reconstruction, we got to spend $30 million in 1980s money to do this. This is not easy work. It would have been a whole lot more now. Let's see. So, sort of the worst place to be was more or less across the river and slightly downwind of all the reactors, which is about Ringgold. So those of us who live in the area know that Ringgold is up in Franklin County, just north of Pasco here. And again, the dose fell off really rapidly, and almost all of it was I-131. In the later years, when they got the iodine under control, it became some other radionuclides. We looked at all the rutheniums and the plutoniums because people wanted us to, and strontium. But the doses, instead of being 1 gray, or 1 rem, were down to 0.0001. So really the big effects happened in the first years while the rushed production was going on, and they were not holding up the fuel very long in that lag storage building before they were dissolving it. So for somebody who lived at the same place the entire period from 1949 through, or 1945 through 1972, when they kind of start shutting down all the reactors, Ringgold was pretty much, western Franklin County, if you will, pretty much the highest. Richland and Altopia were kind of the same. Richland, in part because Richland was a company town, as we heard earlier today, and they had contracts with Dairygold and a couple of other milk suppliers, and milk came into the city from places that was actually mostly upwind rather than downwind, but it was close enough that the dose to people in the town here had quite a bit. As you get further away up towards Ritzville or Spokane, the doses start to fall off. Wenatchee was a little bit out of the plume. Lewiston, Idaho was out of the plume on the other side. So this gives you an idea of what the total doses were. So now we've done all this. What we got? Children living on the Franklin County side exposed to radioactive iodine. What's the effect? Well, radiation is a known carcinogen, right? Okay, we all agree with that. There is reliable evidence that doses above 100 millisieverts or 10 rem or 10,000 millirem can increase the risk of cancer. Okay, we just had doses of 230 rather than 10, so there's a possibility there. For lower doses, the evidence is less clear, but we assume small doses do occur some risk. This is what's called the linear non-threshold hypothesis, or linear no-threshold theory, LNT. Most of us in the industry tend to adhere to this idea that too much radiation is bad for you. An extra dose of about 20 rem increases the risk of fatal cancer, this is the whole body, from the worldwide average of about 25% to about 26%. So 20 rem, on average, will increase your risk of cancer by 1%. So this gives us what we call a risk coefficient, is about 5 times 10 to the minus 4 per rem, 0.0005. So for every rem you get, your risk of cancer goes up by about 0.05%. For radioiodine, which is the most impacted organ, children get higher doses and risks than adults do. Okay, so now we kind of know these things. Well, in 1986, about the time we were doing all this work, there was this accident at Chernobyl. Children's doses, children, anybody from age 0 to 18, from the milk pathway were very, very high from Chernobyl. In the Gomel Oblast in Belarus, average of about 68 rad. Highest doses were such that about 0.5% of the children had doses greater than 10 or 1,000 rad. So here we're talking at Hanford, we had 230. These people had a small fraction, were more than 1,000. Although the median and the average were somewhere between 26 and 79. This is a very skewed distribution. So the median is half have more, half have less. That's 26. But the average is pulled up simply by the few people who have really high numbers. So, it's about 79. There have been epidemiology studies in Belarus and Ukraine. I was the chair of the U.S. National Cancer Institute's advisory committee on these studies. So in Belarus, the study had 12,000 people who were children at the time of the accident. And in the first 10 or 20 years, found 156 cases of thyroid cancer in 12,000 people. In Ukraine, slightly larger cohort, slightly smaller number of cases because the background doses were a little bit lower. The background risk of cancer, of thyroid cancer, is about 0.3% per person in 20 years. It's not common, but it's not that rare. So what this says is that, okay, some of these people, these cases that were found might have been occurred whether they'd been exposed or not, but there was an excess risk between 2 and 5 times in these populations. So that by being exposed, people in Ukraine had 5 times the chance of having a thyroid cancer that they would have had the accident not occurred. And the excess relative risk is about 2 per gray, or about 2% per rad. An excess risk, your normal background risk is 1. If your excess risk is 2, your total risk is really 3. So what this says is that they had about 3 times more cancers overall in that part of Europe in children than would have normally been found. Okay, so that's in Chernobyl. Because we're talking in part with the Japanese, let's look at Fukushima. Okay, there was a whole lot, come on, get back here. Whole lot of iodine released from the Fukushima event. It was 3 reactors melt down, so it's highly enriched or highly burned up fuel that had essentially no decay. So it was about 10 times the amount at Hanford, but it happened all at once. The Japanese were lucky in that the meteorology was such that most of that blew out and landed in the Pacific Ocean. Some of it did not. So the average effective dose in the Fukushima prefecture is about 2 millisieverts, was about 200 millirem. Dose in Fukushima City was somewhat smaller, about 7, 8, 9 millirem, or millisieverts. For people who were evacuated, I found this table in an UNSCEAR report, United Nations Scientific Committee on the Effects of Atomic Radiation. I was one of the reviewers of this report. But the effect, the dose to the thyroid for children was pretty high. 2.2 to 3 to 30 millisievert, which would be 3,000 millirem, 3 rads. Again, this is 3 rads instead of 250 rads at Hanford, but it's a number we would rather avoid. Now, thyroid cancer risk, they performed thyroid screening on 300,000 people in Japan who were younger than the age of 18 at the time of the accident. They found 116 individuals with some sort of thyroid malignancy out of 300,000. This is compared to that same number pretty much out of 10,000 in Ukraine or Belarus. UNSCEAR estimated in 2013 report that compared to the baseline risk in the general population, a radiation-related increase in the increase of cancers would not be expected to be discernible. That means that there may be some, but we can't measure them. Epidemiology is too blunt an instrument to be able to tell that they were actually there, which means that there's not an epidemic of thyroid cancer in Japan. And basically what it says, that's what I just said. There's not enough there to statistically detect, which means there's two reasons for that. The first one, as I said, was that the weather was good and it blew most of the iodine offshore. The other one is that unlike the Soviets, who didn't tell anybody, the Japanese government went in and said, we've had an accident, stop drinking the milk, get the hell out of there. And that made all the difference in the world for these people. So, given that we have evidence that releases of radioiodine to the atmosphere can cause cancer in individuals, thyroid cancer in particular, there was an epidemiology study done at Hanford. The Hanford Thyroid Disease Study was conducted between 1989 and 2002. They used the tools that we developed for the Hanford dose reconstruction. We worked with them through this entire period, transferring our computer codes and our data, and they went out and they actually interviewed people, gave them a pretty big questionnaire about where were you, what did you eat, where'd your cows get their food? And they gave them thyroid examinations, calculated radiation doses using our methods, and they had doses between, up to 200 rad, average of about 20 rad, but they only had 3,400 people who were willing to participate. There was no discernible effect of radiation in this population. Now, this does not mean that there was no effect, but it means the effect was so small that we cannot see it. It was not statistically detectable. Okay, let's move away from people and just talk about the biota for like one page. The environment around the Hanford site has been exposed to heavy metals, toxic chemicals, radiation for the last 70-some years. During the 1960s, you could go out into the Columbia River and you could catch fish and you could put it on a detector and you could count especially the phosphorus 32 in it. Fish take up a lot of P32. But the doses in the fish and the other critters in the river were substantially less than 1 rad per day. That is, in fact, a limit that is implied and imposed in the United States to maintain population stability in natural environments. So they never really exceeded a population dose limit, which again doesn't mean that certain fish didn't die, but most of them did not. Now, they have not observed health effects in plants, terrestrial animals, or aquatic animals from these exposures. The Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry, ATSDR, did an analysis in the early 2000s and published a fairly thick report, which is in my reference list, about what contaminants that they found in plants and animals. And the things that they found were antimony, barium, cesium-137, cobalt-60, manganese, plutonium, strontium, and uranium. And depending on where you looked and what you found, there are things out there that have those materials in them. But again, there doesn't seem to have been an effect on the actual environment and the critters growing therein. So I have a few resources. I almost brought a few of them with me because they're impressive. The Hanford dose reconstruction was overseen, not exactly managed, by a technical steering panel. They have a pretty good report that's available. Bill Ferris and I and others put together a river pathway report and an atmospheric pathway report, which are also available online. CDC put together I gave you a summary, a guide to the Hanford thyroid disease study, which is relatively short. It's maybe 10 or 15 pages. The actual HTDS report is 2 volumes, each this thick. So I don't want to recommend that you try and read it, because in the end, since they didn't find anything, it's not worth your time. And I also put this ATSDR report here for the people, or for the critters. Anyway, I'm done. Right on time. Questions? There's one. That's actually how most of those calculations were done, is that people have studied the bioaccumulation of a lot of different radionuclides. Different people, or different plants and animals take up things differently. I'll give you one example that we discovered that was actually in the records, is that in the 1960s, people would occasionally leave work from Hanford, go down to the coast. And they went to Willapa Bay. And they'd go to the restaurant, they'd buy a bunch of oysters and eat them and come back. Those people would be screaming with zinc 65. Zinc 65 would make it all the way down and into the ocean and into Willapa Bay and into the oysters and accumulate there enough that if you ate a few oysters and came back to work and went through the whole body counter, they could see them. So P32 in fish, particularly Rocky Mountain whitefish, zinc 65 in the oysters, iodine, definitely in cattle and milk. So yes, of the stable materials, there was a thing called the Columbia River Comprehensive Impact Assessment back in the late 90s. It's another one of these really big, thick things where we looked at not only the radionuclides, but also the heavy metals and other chemicals that we had records of, and broke the river up into stretches all the way around the site and down into town. And there are places where there are still higher concentrations of contaminants than you would really want. Most of them are coming out of the groundwater in places like N-reactor. N-reactor was a closed loop system. It didn't dump stuff straight into the river, but occasionally they would have a fuel element failure. They would take the contaminated water and put it in a trench that paralleled the river. It is soaked in and is slowly coming out, so you can get strontium-90 there. They made the uranium fuel in the 300 area, which is just north of Richland. The processed water there went to a pond, again, next to the river, and there is elevated uranium in the groundwater and the ground along the river just north of the 300 area now. And you can see it in asparagus, wild asparagus and mulberries that grow there. So it is, things are still, they still show up, you can still see them. That's part of the reason for doing a lot of the cleanup. Back to you. Yeah, it's a small group. You know, there's not getting a lot of interaction.
And we have somebody presenting at the beginning of our next session who's a downwinder.
Mm-hmm.
Involved in litigation, and I'm just curious about kind of a response to that. The folks who, and I don't have a specific question, but I'm just kind of curious about that.
There is, let us call it a scientific disagreement on the effects that people living downwind might have occurred. I'm not disputing that some people got thyroid cancers who lived in Franklin County. All I'm saying is that we cannot scientifically, statistically say that, yes, that was caused by Hanford. Back in the 80s and 90s, What the downwinders really wanted was essentially Obamacare. You know, they say, you guys should pay for this. You know, you've impacted us. You should do something about it. And to some extent, they never got what they wanted.